Glad to see such great attendance here for 9 a.m. meeting. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Berman?
Here.
Councilmember Burt?
Here.
Chair Klein?
Here.
Councilmember Sharp?
Here.
4 present.
Okay. And just so everybody knows that they're in the right place, this is a meeting of the Infrastructure Committee of the City Council. And we will start with oral communications, where any member of the public can speak to us on any item which is not on the agenda, but which is within our purview. We have one speaker, and Steve, I'm not sure whether you want to speak in oral communications or on one of our 3 agenda items. And we're fairly informal, so I guess the question is, do you want to speak now or later?
Now is fine for me.
Good, all right.
Okay?
All right.
You want me at the microphone?
Yes, please, because the microphone is for recording the meeting.
Right. Is it on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you to the staff and the committee. I've looked at the list, and I don't speak for all the members of the IBRC, but for everyone I know, we're really pleased that the public safety building is back on top of the list. That's not what I came to talk about. The parking structure downtown is on the list, and I want to talk about that in a way that connects to the discussion you all went through, that long one on Monday night. You heard 3 groups on Monday night. I'm going to end up saying build as many parking garages as you can find money for downtown, but you heard 3 groups. You heard businesses talk about the parking issues for their customers. You had a whole bunch of small business owners and employees come and talk about the issues that their lower wage employees have, and you had a whole bunch of residents who live in the neighborhood I do, University South and Professor Bill in downtown North, come and talk about the incredible number of cars on the street. You interestingly didn't have, I don't think I heard any representative from the bad guys, those alleged office workers who come and take the parking places. You had somebody say that he saw only office workers, but that makes no sense because then where were the employees parked? But what I want to talk about is the 5th group that didn't get any attention, which is Caltrain parkers. Down the street's the 2nd busiest Caltrain station. About 5,000 folks a day get on and off. About half get on, about 2,500. Nearly all of those are in the morning. Okay. That system is an important part of what's called transportation demand management. In any way that the committee or the staff working with other cities can improve the frequency of that service is enormous. But I'd like you to ask the staff to figure out how many people, roughly, any way you can, from each of those groups, okay? Because it will make a difference, I think, to your consideration of how many parking structures to build and how to handle the pricing of the parking depending on how many people on the street are higher paid professionals, are lower paid employees, are Caltrain riders, are customers. And remember, most of the Caltrain riders and customers are residents also, and people parking in the neighborhood. So really, I think to inform your decision and do a double duty on the whole parking discussion, I hope you're able with the staff to unbundle who exactly is taking up those parking spaces. Now, I've counted the number in the Caltrain lot, and I walk to the station and I see lots of people dropping off, and that's wonderful, and probably some people come from Menlo Park to get the bullet, and they're not residents. But there's no way that 2,500 northbound morning passengers are going to fill anywhere near the parking spaces that we have. I think the parking structures solve a couple of problems. The residential permit thing is really musical chairs, and I don't want to get into who's got the mess right. But if you shuffle those parking spaces and you end up with nothing that the Caltrain riders can use, and I'm happy to have them pay for it, then you've really not done anything for the residents, not done anything for that problem. Caltrain can't build a parking structure. So I'll end with that. Get a count of how many in each group. It really will help you decide not only the bigger parking issues, but the role of downtown parking garages in solving the problem like you're doing with the police building. I'm so happy you're stepping up and solving the problem with that.
Thank you. Do we have any other cards or members of the public who wish to speak to us? Seeing none, we'll move along. Mr. Keene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I'll do a brief intro and then turn it over to Brad. This is the first item dealing with follow-up related to the project list discussion. And at the last meeting, you directed us to do a couple of things. One was to proceed with planning for a public safety building and to come back with a proposed project list for prioritization. And then that also just sort of begs some questions about the revenue streams that we have and the impact it has on the TOT. So I asked the staff to, rather than bringing back these things separately, to kind of come up with an integrated approach that really kind of lets it, and this is just a suggested cut at it, but I do think it's very helpful being able to both set things in priority and link them directly to the revenues that we have. And then you can see the incremental choices that could be made based upon having a TOT. And then in a lot of ways, and I think the staff can ultimately speak to this, the linkage back to even the IBRIC recommendations and those sorts of things. And I would like to say that I actually think the ability for the council to adopt an infrastructure funding plan, of which a ballot measure is just a component, is an important decision for the city for this year. And I actually think that I don't think we can really effectively support a good community conversation on planning for the public safety building if I think we have a different conversation if the council's actually allocated the funding for it than if that is floating out there and we're still looking for land or whatever. I think it just really makes it so much more concrete. And then this is not on the direction that you did give to the staff, but we were also thinking that that this sort of focus could drive the committee to being able to really make specific recommendations to the council and almost dramatically decrease the work of the committee and up for us to be able to turn our attention ultimately to the outreach and then even the ballot measure kind of piece of all of this. And then we start to turn our attention as a staff on actually, okay, how do we start to plan for and deliver for these different projects? And some of them are more complicated than others. Obviously, the public safety building as it relates to finding land and that sort of thing. And even some of these issues like the parking garages, they start to have linkages with other decisions and conversations the council's going to have. Even over this next month, you're going to have a couple of opportunities to talk about parking investment and TDM and those sorts of things. So it seems like a good convergence of things, and we're hopeful that this one-sheet approach really helps you all drive to some recommendations. Right now, we have scheduled, I think you saw in the report, the tentative check-in with the council as you directed on February 24th. So that is a meeting on the 3rd and a meeting on the 10th and then the 24th. So that's the plan right now. Brad?
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, Chair Klein and council members. So Brad Eggleston, Assistant Director of Public Works, and I'm just going to take a couple minutes to walk us through this draft funding proposal. If there's anyone in the audience that doesn't have this or only has the staff report, there's some larger copies that are a little more easy to look at. So where we start with this approach is the status quo that's all the way to the left, the project list that we've been looking at and talking about in the committee's different meetings. I'll point out a couple of things there that are a little different. In the past discussions, we've combined the downtown parking garages and just kind of shown them as 2 parking garages. Because of the way we're looking at them here, we've actually broken the 2 out and shown them in terms of additional spaces that could be provided. And I would also say this is very preliminary, and the choices of individual garages we might want to work with or build could certainly change. So we start with that $155 million of unfunded projects. Below that, we show the existing funding that's available. It's pretty much the same funding sources that we've been discussing for some time. A couple of things that are different here. We showed the projected, kind of near-term projected parking in lieu funds that we think will be available of about $4 million. And then we've also shown a projected fiscal year 2014 surplus of about $4 million.
That had been requested, I think.
So we end up there with about $92 million in existing funding. And then moving to the right, we take the first step here that we showed as step 1, and we've repeatedly heard from the committee, council members, the IBRIC report about the public safety building really being the top priority. So what we wanted to show here was an approach of funding the public safety building with some of the existing funding. And you can see we're showing $57 million there. We've shown that in this proposal is being funded with the new hotel revenue through COPs, the fiscal year 13 surplus, and part of the Stanford infrastructure funds. And then once you do that, we've shown the cost and then where the funding could come from. When you look below, you'll see that reduces the remaining unfunded projects cost to 97.8, so that's just the difference between the original and the 57. And it reduces the amount of the existing funding that's available to $35.5 million. So then we wanted to take a second step, having funded what we thought was the highest priority, and essentially show how we might use the rest of the remaining existing funding that we already have or project to have soon. So we thought good uses for that could be addressing transportation and parking issues that are of great concern to the community. And so we proposed here building one of the downtown parking garages that we were looking at for $13 million and funding $14.5 million of the bike pedestrian plan. And then we've shown that the funding for that would come from essentially the rest of the Stanford funds, both the infrastructure and sustainability, parking in lieu funds, and that projected fiscal year 14 surplus. Once we do that, the remaining unfunded projects reduces down to $70 million. Our existing funding, there's $8 million left of the infrastructure reserve, which we weren't proposing here to allocate right now towards any particular projects. So then we reach a point where we've used all of the existing funding that we're talking about, and we can start to narrow in and look at, well, if council was to choose to decide to move forward with a TOT measure, what are the additional things we might fund with that? And so what we proposed here, what we thought might be the next highest priorities were, and we've shown this step 3A and 3B 2 different ways, because obviously with a higher TOT increase, we could fund more things. So what we showed with the 2% was funding the fire stations, the remainder of the bike pedestrian plan, and the parks catch-up amount that came from the IBRIC's work. And that's roughly equal to the funding we think we could get from the 2% TOT. And if we were to do that, then you would see there's about $40 million in other unfunded projects. Or with a 3% TOT increase, on top of those, we had shown here that we could fund the remaining small portion of the bike bridge over 101, the Bixby Park project, and the additional sidewalks spending that we had talked about. And if we were to do that, we're down to about close to $30 million in other projects.
Why is there a difference in the bike pedestrian plan between 6.5 and 8? Is that a typo? If you look on 3A, it's 6.5 on the bike. If you do the 2% TOT, and the 3%, it's $8 million.
That is a typo.
No,
it's not.
There's a remaining portion under the, if you, on the 2% TOT, there's a remaining portion of 1.7 million.
And that's the bike bridge.
Oh, no, excuse me.
Yeah, that's a typo. Good catch. So a couple other things to point out here. I said we weren't showing programming the $8 million infrastructure reserve. We also didn't show here using the $19.6 million that we said we might net from leasing out the current police building. The main reason for that was that's far enough down the line that we didn't know if it made sense to try to say now what specifically it would be used for, but wanted to point out that that is potential additional funding down the line.
Well, let me stop you there and
Okay.
say, one of my major questions was, why not allocate the $8 million in the infrastructure reserve?
We certainly could, and I don't think any of this is meant to preclude discussion and making changes.
No, but I want to know what your thinking was in holding that back.
I think the only thought is, and I mean, it's a good perspective, but your question's equally good. But each year, we get way more project requests in the CIP than we can fund, and so our practice has typically been to fund as many of them, but still leaving some money in the reserve to be able to kind of program and carry forward from one year to the next. So we know that even in this year, I think we've got maybe potentially almost $40 million worth of requests and limited amounts of money. Did we want to just sort of carry that there was always some flexibility for the city to be adapting in any given year? That being said, obviously, there are some even identified projects on here that even with the 3% TOT are not really programmed to be funded. So you could sort of say, well, why shouldn't we spend that infrastructure reserve to that? So it was just our thought about still carrying some balance there for either these projects as you get down the road, some change in what our estimates are off on something, or for the CIP itself. And one other thing, just since I have this, we're not wedded to this, obviously. We tried to do a little bit of thinking about the relationship between cash flow and sort of project timing. So, for example, again, as Brad made the point that the COPs on the new hotels, it's going to take us a couple of years to get through the planning and readiness piece on the public safety building. So earmarking the money is fine, but it gives us time for those monies to accrue. But, you know, I'm not saying you would look at it this way, but you could say, well, wait a minute, I think we need to do more on garages than we're doing on some of these things. I don't know, and you may want to move some of that and some of these other issues out. And the last point I would say is, I think at the last meeting, the discussion was, as it related to the TOT measure, was that an advisory measure wasn't recommended or wouldn't do any good. But we did have some thought, at least, of trying to say, well, at least at this stage, if you're talking about a tax measure that would go to the ballot, do we want to be talking about the right kind of projects that sort of justify why you're doing that? And we maybe didn't explicitly do that correctly. But a little bit of our thought on some of these things is the bike pedestrian plan, even the parks and some of those things, was to say, as part of tourism and people coming to our town and everything, we want to be sure that we've got linkages and things connected to visitors and all of those things as part of our thinking on the infrastructure plan. May not be a good argument, but that was a little bit of what the staff was thinking.
And I had really walked through everything I wanted to say, so
Okay,
I'd like to
go to questions from the rest of the committee. Pat?
Well, first, this is a question and comment related to what both Steve Levy said and what the city manager just spoke about. So with the bike and pedestrian plan, there's also potentially a significant component of that accentuates the feeder system into our two Caltrain stops. And I know that there's been an increasing amount of discussion by the Friends of Caltrain and others that this is an essential component of the Caltrain system. BART has chosen to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on massive parking structures at their BART stations as the way that they assume people get to BART predominantly, not exclusively. Caltrain doesn't have that in their strategic plan, and they don't have any dollars for it. And so a much more progressive vision is to get people to Caltrain and from Caltrain through other means. And whether it's some combination of our expanded shuttle that the city manager has spoken about, but also the bike system. And I don't think we've had enough discussion or really planning around our bike master plan having a significant component of it being toward feeding into transit. And I think it's essential to our long-term city vision around greater transit use with Caltrain as the backbone. So you don't have to comment unless you have any thoughts on it, but I wanted to get that on the table.
If I might,
Just
real quick, as an aside.
Just coincidentally, we were having a meeting earlier this morning with VTA and Stanford and the transit station, the Marguerite, and all of those sorts of things. And so Stanford, and I was talking about our shuttle plans, no details, but the fact that we're going to be really advancing this. And so your point is a good one also, that the kind of capacity issue at the transit center and everything is, I mean, it's dramatically increasing, both given the Caltrain ridership and a dramatic uptick apparently in Marguerite use, particularly connected to the hospital. So VTA and other folks were talking about seeing a real behavioral change in how people are traveling. And so as we think about that, I think your comments are a really spot on one, that we've got to be thinking about a network, kind of a varied network system of feeding into these connections.
Well, and I don't want to get too far afield in the TDM discussion around the capital improvements, but there is clearly an intersection, and the better that we can address some of these needs through measures other than building parking garages, it influences this discussion, and especially the timing, because I'm very hesitant to be considering 2 parking garages downtown and 272 spaces at Cal Ave prior to implementing our TDM program. I'm open to some portion of that, but putting on the table a need which I hope that we will avoid through other means, I think is much more appropriate. And I'll just add, when you talk about that, the ways in which behavior change occurs and people get to and fro the Caltrain stations, including Cal Ave, which is going to be expanded certainly once electrification comes through. That's going to become a much more heavily used station, and it will balance out somewhat our 2 stations. Right now, University has the overwhelming passenger boarding, not only because it has higher demand for that location, but because riders who are actually closer to Cal Ave choose University because it has the baby bullet, and the express trains in Cal Ave doesn't. And that'll change with electrification. But there is another whole set of mode changes that are emerging in new technologies. And we used to call this issue around the last mile of people taking transit. They would go that last mile walking. Well, we have people who take bikes on the trains, and that very much takes up cars. But there's a whole new set of alternatives, whether they're electric scooters, electric bikes that allow people to go many miles after they get off, a whole bunch of things. And I don't want to get into the details there, but I just want to make sure that's on the table in our thinking as to how we're going to avoid the need to build hundreds of Caltrain parking spots going forward, and how we're going to even address what I have heard repeatedly is a present overflow of Caltrain riders being part of the neighborhood parking problem. So I'll leave that one. A question on the TOT. How much did that revenue shrink during the recession, at the worst period of the recession?
I believe it shrank as much as $3 to $4 million.
Okay, so that may be something that we're going to want to put into our considerations, because when we look at anticipated revenues, are we putting them in a strong economic time? It doesn't mean they won't get stronger yet than where they are now, but they could get worse too. And we don't want to make promises to voters and then suddenly a recession happens and we're digging out of the we encumber those dollars for a COP and then we start digging out of general fund dollars that have already shrunk in order to pay down a COP that we thought was going to be able to be funded through that revenue stream. So I think we need to think that one through. I haven't heard any mention of that variability. Yeah, Joe.
That issue was raised in prior infrastructure committees. That your point is well taken.
Okay,
Ups and downs.
but I don't see it here. So when we talk about anticipated revenue, I haven't heard any reference to the what ifs.
We haven't included that.
Okay, so that's the point I'm making. So it's good we talked.
Actually, I think we have covered it, because when you calculate the amount of certificates of participation you can sell, you have to have some cushion in there. So you can't leverage every last dollar that you collected in year one over they just won't finance it.
Well, I think you know what we've done is used a ratio of a certain
Right,
amount
right.
of debt for what you can issue
Yes.
in certificates of participation.
Right, and that's a built-in cushion, I think.
But I think interest rates can change by the time we go to do the issue. It could be a little bit less. It could be a little bit more. I think we, I know that we have mentioned that is, if there's a significant shortfall in the TOT or economically sensitive one, the reality is that, if it's a very significant, that the general fund would have to absorb that commitment.
Well, what I'd like to see is transparency on what those assumptions are, because you're saying kind of in a general way they've been discussed, but I can't see what assumptions have been made. And I think that's important for us.
What is the ratio? That's really.
1 to 14, we think for COPs, if you issue $1 million worth, for $1 million worth of debt service, you can have 14 million in project
No.
funds.
What's the revenue versus, how much revenue is committed? You said there's a ratio. It's a percentage.
How much revenue? I think we said that with the new hotels, it was 2.4. With the increase of 2%, it was around 2.2.
Yeah, but I don't.
But what percentage of the revenue is committed?
Okay, let's. I don't want to get bogged down in it. Please provide the committee members who are concerned with it the calculations that go into it, as what bond counsel would say we could issue and how it would be covered.
And the sensitivity factors on that variable. Okay, and then under the parking garages, whether they are Cal Ave or downtown, currently our garages are funded by the assessment district, and but if these are going to be assumed to be fully funded by the city, is there a revenue side to those? How much of the potential revenue, and there's certainly a maintenance cost. So I haven't heard anything about what revenue is anticipated and what portion of that revenue would be toward operations and maintenance versus debt service.
So the way it could be potentially structured is that we're going to have about 4 million, as Brad mentioned, 4 million. Let's suppose for a minute it's the 13 million that Brad has down here. We'd have 4 million in lieu fees by the end of 14. There may be additional in lieu fees if the city were to move forward with.
And you know I'm not talking about in lieu fees.
Well, I think.
I'm talking about,
Permit fees.
Yes, okay. I thought your question, the first part of your question was related to how we would fund
No,
the
it's-
building.
no.
Okay, so the maintenance fees are always, maintenance of a garage is always funded through the parking permit.
that's not, so my question is, right now.
I can help
Yeah,
with this.
okay.
So we haven't looked at that yet, first of all. I mean, so the question really, and I think this is going to be part of the parking item we're going to bring on the 10th that starts to direct us to look at things, but it also is going to imply, one, thinking differently about how we will charge for and price parking in new parking garages. So, for example, I think that Pat's question really is okay, well, wait a minute, we might charge, significant fees, not just permit fees, but for day parking, or how we do all of these things, and that's going to provide an annual revenue stream, and how does that reduce actually the cost, the net cost for this project from whatever it is, $13 or $16 million to something else over time. I think we'll also be, though, having to look at that and think about the access control and pricing we're doing on our other existing garages that could still be in the assessment district, but obviously what we want to do is manage and force as much uptake in garages as we can. So it is all integrated. But I think it's a good point. When we get to it, obviously it either can reduce the estimate that we're sort of using for planning, or provides an extra revenue stream that, if you wanted to, gets pumped back into the, along with the infrastructure reserve and additional funding. So we'll have that going forward.
And on garages also, I see that under step 3A, we've got 272 spaces for Cal Ave. I don't recall any discussion on that scale of a parking garage for Cal Ave. That's from when we saw this the last meeting, and afterward it just really took me back that wow, that is a big parking structure for Cal Ave, and that skews our balance sheet on this, on revenue versus expenses for these projects. So I'd like to know how we came up with that big of a number, and two, can we put in here consideration of a smaller garage? I mean, the garages on Cambridge are less than 100 spaces each, I believe, right?
I don't know the.
Okay, so we've got a number for 272 spaces, but we don't know how big the garages we currently have are. I think, I don't know where this number just came from.
Go ahead. To say something is that at the time we came up with these estimates, I would say these are not well planned out and actual proposals for what we think we would want to build there. The committee discussed polling on parking garages in the downtown and Cal Ave area, and we kind of scrambled around a bit to look at what could be the possibilities for lots where garages could be built. We had a consultant, the transportation group, had a consultant go look at a couple of the different lots and see if we were to build a 5-story parking structure, how many spaces could we add? And
So
that's where this has come from.
My suggestion, I'd be interested in what colleagues think, is that rather than using a placeholder of a 272 space garage for Cal Ave, we put a placeholder of, say, 100 space, which is, I believe, larger than either of the existing garages on Cambridge. And that significantly changes the equation here on our shortfall under option 3A. That's like a $10 million swing. And then the public safety building leaseback revenue, I think that I appreciate that the timing of it and capital dollars that would have to go into it have to be part of the consideration, but I think it should be part of the anticipated funding. I mean, it's that the value of that is there. I'm fine with you being conservative on the timing and conservative on the revenue and building in the capital costs, but let's get it baked in here, because then you know, if you've got another 15 million in revenue and you have another 10 million less in expenses for that Cal Ave lot, geez, suddenly this whole discussion changes quite a bit. I'll also say that I am concerned about the fire stations. I think they're a priority, and I'd like to have more discussion about how high of a priority they are, because now they're only under 3A. If we have the 2% TOT, they're well covered, especially with these other changes, if the ones I just talked about are accepted. But in my mind, that is a responsibility that is right up there with the public safety building. And we have public safety building as a priority under 1, but the fire station's under 2. And if they're not as high of a priority from the standpoint of public safety, I'd like to have that understanding, because from my last understanding of it, they really were comparable. They haven't had the press or the discussion in public to the degree the public safety building has. But they are, I thought, essentially required for us to have emergency responsibility in the event of a major quake. So I don't have to get all the answers right now on that, but that's a consideration. And then I'm just about done here. Sidewalk discussion. I had raised at the last meeting this issue that we basically are funding our street repairs at nearly triple what we were 4 years ago. And we are now funding it at a level where we are going from it's not the technical range, but essentially good to fair streets to within a few years we'll have reached very good to excellent. The funding that we have right now doesn't need to be sustained once you get to excellent to keep them excellent. And I haven't seen that backed out. So we've front-ended this process. We're overfunding the ongoing needs for street repair in order to keep them at excellent once they get to that point. And I haven't heard that built into this equation, and I think the sidewalk repair 6 million shortfall will more than be met by that readjustment, but I don't know those numbers. So I shouldn't say I think so. I think there's a very good possibility. So we are now, we were at what, 1.8 or 9 million in street repair back in calendar 2010 or 2009-10 period, and we're now at 5.8,
5.7 or something like that, and we're.
And how much do we need once we get to excellent? How much do we need to stay excellent?
So I think we can ultimately get you that. The committee will recall that our latest increase has allowed us to reduce getting to the 80 mark or the excellent mark in 2019 from 2021. So that's 5 years out is what this plan. So that shift takes place then. We'll start to identify it.
That's assuming that we prioritize getting to excellent on streets before we get to very good on sidewalks. And my argument would be we should treat streets and sidewalks in a similar vein and have a plan that moves both of them forward on a comparable timeline. And I don't understand why we've broken up streets from sidewalks. We've got, I think we ought to be thinking this as a street and sidewalk funding, and what's the pace at which we get from where we've been to very good and then excellent on both of them. And if we look at that hybrid approach, we might see a different picture on that. And because frankly, we've had complaints now from members of the community that the streets are torn up too much from repaving and fixing the streets. So we're at a point at which, you know, how much street repair can you do at once? So I'll leave it there.
Greg, I see your right hand up.
Sure. Couple things. I guess the first thing is I would strongly support the bike and pedestrian plan for a lot of the reasons Pat said. I mean, I do think that brings people to the Caltrain stations. It provides another network, gets cars off the road. So I think that's a good choice to put in. And overall, I think this is, you know, a good framework. I think staff's done a really good job on putting this together. When we get to the parking garage issue, I do think it's really important that we build that, at least that first parking garage downtown. I think we probably need to build that second parking garage sooner than later. And I think we need to be a little realistic about parking. We've allowed it to become a crisis situation downtown. And, you know, it's come for a lot of factors and stuff. And, you know, wouldn't necessarily easy to foresee the way things have ramped up after the recession. But it's become a crisis. And I think the community views it as a crisis. When you listen to the fear in the merchants when they came and spoke, when you listen to the frustration of the homeowners, it's a bad situation. And, you know, there's probably at least 1,500 cars out there. I think if we build 300 spaces downtown, we're drawing cars out of the neighborhood, providing that overflow. We're not increasing traffic by doing that. We are solving a current problem that really exists that we need to get solved. So I think for me, building those two garages are one of the highest priorities. And then I think we need to be a little realistic about Cal Ave. There's a problem in the Ventura neighborhood. Nielsen Buchanan's come forward and says that, in fact, Ventura is heading in a way that's as bad as Professorville and downtown. Now, I don't think it's at a crisis situation, frankly, in Ventura and that neighborhood yet. But if we do nothing and don't build the California Avenue garage, that's on us. I think that would be shame on us.
I didn't say nothing.
I didn't say anything about you at all, Pat. I wasn't even talking about you.
Oh, okay. Go to neutral corners.
So I do think that we need to be really focused on Cal Ave and say to ourselves, how do we stop it from being a crisis situation? How do we stop it from developing into that? And I think it's forward thinking to go ahead and build a parking garage there. I think we need to do that now before it's a crisis situation. It takes a while to build a garage. It takes a while to get it. And I think we need to decide how much spaces we need there. And I think that has to do with, we need to look and see how many cars are in the neighborhood, what we anticipate the growth to be there, and look at that. I'm not sure if it's a 270-car garage, but I see no reason to say it's a 100-car garage or a 50-car garage. I think we also need to look at the efficiency of the spots and say to ourselves, you know, when you have a parking, I don't know which lot you're planning on using, but it's the number of floors you do, and then look at the expansion of it. So it's not the number of spaces. I think we need to go out there and do some quick design and say what makes sense and what increments are the choices in that and how much it costs. So I think that's something we really need to stay focused on and make sure we build those parking garages. The next thing that's not on here that I think we have to talk a little bit about is the History Museum. So I think there's two issues on the History Museum. The first one is when they were planning their funding, they're thinking of using, what do we call them, TDRs.
History Museum is coming to us on, what, the 3rd, isn't it?
Well, we're having to, I haven't called them yet, I'm gonna do that today, but we have to move it out, just given we've got the golf course project and EIR, the bunch of stuff, so we just don't have enough time, so.
But this all relates
But
to.
it will be.
Okay, go ahead.
But the thing is, we need to have a plan of a little bit in this of what we're gonna do or where that's money coming. There's sort of a commitment to the History Museum in some ways on this issue of the TDRs, transfer development rights. I know in their budget, they have it down that they wanted to sell those and get $1 million for them. And that would exacerbate the parking issue downtown if that occurs. And so the question is, are we gonna allow those TDRs to be sold, because they're the city's TDRs, with parking or without parking? If we sell them without parking, that obviously doesn't exacerbate, but they're worth less. Are we gonna make up that shortfall? And then the other issue comes up is, are we gonna provide any support in terms of a challenge, you know, pay half of it? I think they're $3 million short.
2.4 was the.
Right, so are we gonna come in and pay $1 million to kickstart that where they raise the rest, or are we gonna pay some of it? And until we have that discussion at council and make that decision, we need to have some ability to put some money in for things like that. And I think that gets back to the concern about using the entire infrastructure reserve. I'd like to see it used too, but if you have no flexibility at that point, when things come up, you can't solve the problem and you don't have any money for it. So I would not, I think we should do some of it.
I beg to differ. We have a regular infrastructure, we have a regular CIP budget, which is, what are we spending this year, roughly?
What are you gonna, I mean, if you take out the bond money that we have, 14, 15 million bucks, is that in the ballpark?
Yeah, so we do have money to spend each year, and how we choose to spend it.
No, I think we should, I'm not disagreeing completely with you. I'm just saying we
No, I
should-
wanted to get that point across anyway, because it's sort of related to some of the things Pat was talking about. And it was one of the main points that this committee made last year, that we really had to integrate this discussion of these projects with the regular CIP, that you just can't ignore the fact that we're spending $14 or $15 million on infrastructure every year anyway. And where that line is drawn between those projects and these special projects is not a clear, bright line. Just to use the example you're talking about, it's not inconceivable that if the council wanted to spend money on a history museum, it could find X 100,000 or $1 million or whatever it is out of that regular CIP.
If I could just add, Mr. Chairman, I mean, that was a little bit of, a small part of our hope on the committee being able to recommend a funding plan out of this in a timely enough way so it really does inform the Finance Committee's review ultimately on the CIP itself for the year, so that we do start to build that on the decision-making, but on the communication we do with the community about the, the whole range of the integrated funding that the city's going to provide. So that would be good news to be able to start to report that.
And then I think we should think a little bit about this lease revenue. I don't disagree that it should be integrated, but it could be really far out there. I don't know how long it's going to take us to find land to build a public safety building, but what are we thinking? Finish that public safety building 4 years from now? 5 years from now? So one of
5 years.
One of the interesting questions is we know we get the revenue, but we know it's, 5 years out. First of all, I guess I'm a little concerned, are we going to be able to lease all of that space out, or are we going to grow as a city? Are you going to need the space? I mean, obviously, we've learned that since we rent out at the development center, it's fairly expensive to rent space downtown. So, I mean, I'd hate to commit all of that money and then have no room for growth in the city employees. I mean, so are we looking at that? Are we thinking that there'll be less, or any reaction to that?
Yeah, we haven't done any different sensitivity analyses on different assumptions about that.
But wouldn't that be an expense offset if we did it that way? So if we didn't lease the development center, then it's the same thing. In fact, it's better revenue, because we're not anticipating $7 a square foot for backfilling the public safety building. We're anticipating some fraction of that. But if we move the development center, for instance, moved out of there to occupy this, then it's an even greater savings than what we've projected.
I know it's a greater savings, I agree with you. I just think we need to be a little careful about spending the money and then not having the budget to go ahead and to do these things if we're going to actually increase some of the employee staff. And I mean, it seems that there's quite a bit of staffing. We're talking about increasing staffing quite a bit these days, it seems. I mean, it seems that there seems to be hiring more employees, more stuff going on. And so I just think we have to be a little careful about allocating all of that and having no growth room in the city. So, but if we are going to allocate that 5 years from now, it did strike me that there may be some possibility of borrowing the money, for instance, from like the Calaveras Fund or something, and then paying it back, and that way you could actually build the infrastructure stuff now. I don't know if that would work, but there may be an opportunity to say to ourselves, well, we're going to have this revenue 5 years from now, but we could spend it now and then pay it back from that, if there was some possibility like that. I don't know, but I was thinking something we should think about, how we get this all done. And then, let's see. On the sidewalks and the additional spending, do we give much thought to the $6 million? I mean, was it a number we just sort of pulled out, or was it, how did that all work?
It was a number we came up for polling purposes. So you recall that last summer in one of the meetings we had a discussion about this, and we talked about the fact that we were going to propose in the upcoming CIP a study where we would actually look at what would be the funding needs to have a program for sidewalks similar to what we're doing on streets. So the $6 million really is kind of a placeholder number that's based on a figure that we knew we could get a lot of sidewalks work done for that amount, but we don't yet have figures that would tell us, for instance, what if we wanted to reduce our 30-year cycle of working through the sidewalk districts down to 20 years or 15 years, and that's the subject of a future study.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that point? I thought, because at least in IBRIC, we had talked about that 30-year cycle was kind of what we were working under, and I thought there was a concern that that wouldn't be finished in 30 years, and the point that you made of cutting it down to 25 or to 20. I thought, you know, I just flipped the IBRIC report real quick, and we had 3.7 million in there, but I mean, it was something around. There was some basis for a $3 to $4 million number for either wrapping up that 30-year cycle in time because it had fallen behind, or something to that effect. Correct?
Yeah, so when the IBRIC did its work, you're correct, it identified that $3.7 million number, and what that was the extra funding that was needed to essentially catch up on the 30-year cycle, the original 30-year cycle, and finish it in the 30 years. And we've now funded that. Beginning this fiscal year, we added $1 million a year over the next 5 years in the budget, so that we can.
3.7 that was in the IBRIC is already
that's
handled.
off the table now. That's taken out of the surface catch-up figure that the IBRIC had calculated.
That's helpful to know. Thanks.
So basically, the sidewalk, you're going to relook at that and look at whether or not to have a better cycle and get a better number on that, or are we going to stick with this number? What's the thought on that?
Yeah, we're gonna study it and look and see what the cost would actually be. And this number of $6 million was never meant to be that. It was never tied to saying, well, if we did that, we think we could reach some condition level of sidewalks throughout the city. It was a large number relative to the amount we spend every year, and we were looking and saying, well, how many square feet of sidewalk could we replace? And I think we looked and said that represented some percentage of the sidewalks throughout the city. But it wasn't an informed type of process that said, well, what would be needed for an ongoing program to get us where we would need to be.
And a 30-year cycle versus a 20-year cycle, is there a reason we use the 30-year cycle? Is it just mostly for money that we've chosen the 30-year cycle, or is there an optimal cycle in the way you do things if you had unlimited funds?
I don't know why the 30-year cycle was chosen to begin with in 1986. I haven't looked back to those discussions, but I would definitely think that a shorter cycle would be more optimal, because what we see in Palo Alto, a town with so many trees, is a lot of damage from tree roots. And so if you go through one area and you're not coming back for 30 years, we've got a lot of issues in areas where we've been to much more in a shorter time than 30 years. You know, we might work in an area 15 years ago and be getting complaints now that we've got sidewalks uplifted by roots where we're having to go have crews repair those problems as spot repairs.
I'd like to know what the optimal cycle actually is. I think the board make it at some point. Thanks.
Mark.
So my colleagues have brought up some great questions, and it just kind of made me realize I still think we need to flesh out a lot of these numbers. And I've been looking at this as more of a guide and less as we're going to be locking this amount of money in for these projects. But it helps kind of put things into a broader context. And, you know, I think Greg's questions on sidewalks, you know, bring up, is the $6 million number correct? Past questions on Cal Ave. I actually spent about an hour on Monday morning driving through Cal Ave in response to an email that we got from Nielsen where he said he thinks Evergreen Park is gonna blow up faster than downtown. And I'm not convinced that's the case. I did a drive-through. I had some email back and forth with Nielsen and some others, and they said, well, Monday morning isn't the perfect time to come out on a Tuesday through Thursday. I'll do that at some point. But, I wonder what sort of decrease in demand we can create, or really increased supply we can create by changing around the existing parking capacity we have. There's, a lot of the 2-hour parking lots were totally empty while there were people parking in the neighborhoods. I'm not going to get into the details of all that now, but we need to have a discussion on Cal Ave, on what makes sense there, on what other possibilities there are, and that'll help us figure out exactly how much increased supply we need. I'm not convinced that it's 272 spots, but I'm not going to start guessing as to what it is. Another thing that we didn't really talk about, which was noted in a minuscule footnote on the spreadsheet, is the off-site parking and the shuttle for that and how much that will cost, but also how that'll add supply essentially for Cal Ave in downtown without building parking garages in downtown and Cal Ave. And so it's something that we need to also be considering, is that might be a cheaper way to add supply, and that's a longer conversation that we'll have when staff brings that to us at full council. One quick note that I'd be remiss if I didn't point out is that an eighth of a cent sales tax increase would add $5.6 million more than the 2% TOT. So something to think about for a way to get a little more revenue than the 2% TOT increase, but less than the 3%. I'm glad that we're funding at least kind of mentally setting aside the money for the public safety building. I've been working under that assumption personally for the last 6 months, but wasn't going to state it publicly because I didn't think that was appropriate. But I think it's the right move to we have that funding to set that aside. Another point that I want to just bring up is this plan assumes full spending of the Stanford money, which, again, is a conversation that we need to have at the full council level. We haven't figured out.
We've already had it. We set up a priority, said we did want to spend it all.
But we didn't necessarily talk about what we were going to spend it on.
Right. But we did say that remember there was...
on big projects, I remember the conversation.
Yeah.
We were going to say it was going to be on big transformative things, which these would be.
Right.
I'm just pointing out that we can't assume that the other 5 colleagues are all going to go along with this.
No,
or any of this.
that's correct, but we set the basic policy that we were going to spend it, because remember, there was language in the staff report saying, oh, maybe we want to set it up as
An endowment. I remember.
And the council very emphatically said no to that.
Yep. But there are there could be other requests for that funding that we're not considering here, in addition to infrastructure. You know me, I'm a huge infrastructure advocate, that's why I ran for council. But I'm just pointing out that that's a discussion that we need to have. Can I get a sense from staff? I was looking at the items that we're leaving off of this, and I pretty much agreed with the fact that most of those items, there were 6 items listed on the packet page 5. 7 items listed on packet page 5. The 2 that I wanted to get a little better understanding of was surface catch-up and buildings catch-up. And what's, $3.4 million for surface catch-up, $4.2 million for building catch-up. Is that a lot of nickel and diming kind of smaller projects, or what makes up those numbers? What makes up those amounts?
For the most part, I think it is, you could say, nickel and dime type projects, because I'm not remembering any large ones right now. For instance, I do recall that the surface catch-up, some of that still consists of city facility parking lots that need repairs. Some of it did consist of traffic signal light and system upgrades. So there were some items like that.
And a lot of stuff that can be kind of folded into our annual CIP
right.
budget.
And the same with the buildings catch-up. I think we've got that down to just at $4.5 million or something now. I don't believe there's any one very large component of that. And so that's why we had identified those as things where we were likely to be able to just fund them through the ongoing CIP and try to identify priorities and roll them into that process.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to get some clarity on that. In regards to the idea of keeping the $8 million infrastructure reserve kind of aside and keeping the public safety building money aside, I don't think we're saying we're not going to spend that money. I think we're just saying we're not going to allocate where we're going to spend that money yet. I mean, there's still, there's still more project needs than we have funding. And so, to me, that's us saying, well, let's have some money aside for, as the situation changes, as we implement TDM, as we implement the RPP, as we maybe get an off-site parking garage, and let's have some flexibility to be able to kind of recalibrate in a couple of years, depending on how effective the programs that we're putting in place now really are. And I think that there's some logic to that, because we are going to be instituting a lot of pretty transformative changes to how people park and get around in Palo Alto, and I don't know how those are going to turn out, and I'm sure they're not going to turn out exactly how we anticipate they're going to turn out. And I think it makes some sense to have some money available to make changes and additions to those projects as we get a sense for exactly how that plays out in a couple of years. So I see us spending the 19.6 from the public safety building and the $8 million infrastructure reserve. I'm just not sure where yet, and so I'm less concerned about kind of keeping that money set aside on this guide. The point about the fire stations, I think there's a general thing, something that we have to consider. I consider the public safety building is a high priority, and I think we absolutely should set $57 million aside and kind of lockbox that, if you will. But the $20 million for the bike and pedestrian plan, the downtown garages, the fire stations, if whatever revenue generating measure we put on the ballot in November doesn't succeed, I think we have to revisit our priority list. I don't consider this as locked in stone that $27.5 million will automatically go to these projects. So yeah, again, as I said at the beginning, this is more of a guide for me for most of the projects. It's not necessarily set in stone, and hopefully we succeed on the revenue generating measure. But if it doesn't, obviously we're going to revisit this and revisit where we spend that funding. Did I have any other questions? I mean, and again, to reemphasize, we need to flesh out these numbers, and I think that we can make decisions generally today. I don't think that should preclude us from making decisions, but we need to get some clarity on why these numbers are what they are, and whether or not it makes sense for them to change up or down. Thanks.
Okay, I have a variety of questions and comments. Since I think we've been longer on comments than we have been on questions, frankly, and I probably will be no exception to that. I'll start with what I think is fairly easy. We have the last 1.7 of the bike bridge over in category 3, step 3B. I don't understand how that would work because we had funding for the rest of the bike bridge, the $8.3 million, but we're not going to get that $8.3 million if we don't spend the $1.7 million.
I think that is funding that we're going to have to spend, and we're going to have to appropriate that to that project one way or another.
Either that or we'll only get 80% of the bridge built.
There's your infrastructure reserve.
So it seems to me we got to put the bike bridge money over into step 2. And that's just, well, I think it's obvious. Okay. Since we're not talking about spending money on the public safety building for several years, wouldn't it be appropriate to build in some interest on the, and I know we're calculating interest on the Stanford money, but I don't think we've reflected that in this, since I don't think there's any way we'd be spending money on the public safety building for at least 2 or 3 years, and interest on $30 million for 2 years is presumably another $2 or $3 million.
So that's speaking to a level in this plan that we haven't got to yet, so I think it's a good point. We were partially thinking of issues like that when we chose to show here the 33.6 from the new hotel COPs. Part of the thinking on that was we know all that new hotel revenue is not going to be in place for a couple of years, and that the main cost for constructing the public safety building wouldn't come till a couple of years down the line. But there probably is an opportunity.
Well, no, I agree with what you just said, but we also want to do it on the other side, and the interest that's going to be accruing is on, in my view, on the other side. So Lalo's going to agree or disagree.
No, I agree with you. One of the projects we're working on, Joe and I met this morning, but it's not ready for showtime, is on a cash flow basis. And so that's where this equation would come in. So this is more on a project basis. Now we need to do it on a cash flow basis. Jim has asked us to work on that, and we're working on that. And then we'll show that to the committee. One of the puzzles that is still unknown, because we haven't finalized the transaction and we're not close yet, is the post office. But that's part of the equation that we're looking at, all the other projects, current CIPs, and these projects. And going back to the question about what the balance should be, that cash flow will help determine that and help with that as well.
Well, while I have you there,
Sure.
one of the numbers here is a projected surplus of $4 million in the present fiscal year. And I know that
You know my reluctance.
you're always conservative, which is
Yes.
appropriate. So I'm assuming that $4 million, based on present calculations and so forth, is a conservative number, and there might very well be more than that.
It could potentially be. We've had a significant change in one of our sources, and that's why you're seeing 4 million. And as you're right, typically you're not but ready to give out a number at this point. But we felt that we needed to put a number out, and we feel comfortable with 4.
Well, just a little bit more. We actually had an estimate of $4.6 million right now, but there's a lot of spending on the operating side that we're going to have to do on some of these engagement and outreach and some of these different staffing pieces on the stuff. So I did leave the budget office $600,000 for planning purposes right now. But your point's a different one. What's the number in August? So.
Okay. Well, mentally, I'll add in another million or two.
Do we hear 3? I'm going to put that in the public, by the way. That's a good one.
Mentally, I'm
Mentally,
gonna add another
yeah.
million or two.
Fire stations, and I think that this has been a good time to bring it up, and I'm glad that other colleagues have. But we've never really had a session, and I think we need to, as to whether, how extreme the need is. All of us have been through the police building and really appreciate how inadequate it is, downright dangerous maybe. But I don't think we have the same level of confidence in the fire stations, and it's not just one, it's more than one. And so are we prepared to do that, or what's the staff's belief on all that?
Yeah, I think that, I think there could be a variability of opinion even on the staff side about the urgency. So I think you guys had done enough work during the iBrick, right, that we could ultimately resuscitate that and update it and be able to support a session with the council. I'm looking at you guys, especially you.
Sure, yes.
Well,
Okay.
Would it be something the committee would be, I mean, you talked about touring the current police building. Would the
well, I think
committee-
everybody here is toward the police building.
I'm
but
thinking of the fire stations.
Yeah, well,
Would we want to talk about them here, or?
I'd be certainly interested in hearing the case as to why I mean, to me, there's a case to the police public safety building, if I could make it happen, should happen tomorrow. I don't know if that's true for the fire stations or not.
I'd like to
Right.
tour over, could have a session on it.
I mean, and maybe send out, I mean, there is a pretty good section on the infrastructure in the iBrook report. Maybe recirculate that to jog everyone's memory, and then having a discussion about it, I think.
Well, okay, but since we have several members of the iBrook here, would you all tour the fire station?
I never did. That wasn't part of I wasn't on that committee.
Steve, no? Ray?
My understanding is that these are wooden stations that, going back to
Late
the
40s.
Addison study way back,
Oh,
that
sorry.
these were buildings that were small buildings, wooden buildings, et cetera. And so, the current fire engines fit there, but I think the idea is that these buildings are very old to accommodate new equipment. They're wooden, and it's not the best kind of building to have.
I thought there was a seismic issue as well.
Yeah, and there's a seismic issue as well. Of course, a fire engine might be able to get out of that wooden building if
Like-
it's seismic.
They kind of, the current engines kind of fit there. There's a great photo in the iBrook
They kind of
report.
fit.
Yes, I recall that, and,
Yeah.
and I see it, since I passed the Embarcadero station virtually every day, I can see them just fitting in very, very carefully. I'm not saying one thing or another, I'm just saying that we haven't really gone into depth.
Sure.
So could arrange a tour for those of us who want to take it, and a more in-depth presentation for the next time. And that also gets to the number as well. We've heard a lot over time about the 57 million for the police station. And we asked the chief to go back and see what he could squeeze down, and he did. We haven't had that level, I don't think, of the fire stations. And also, from time to time, we talk about whether we really need all the fire stations. And now we have the Stanford situation too, which I don't know how that enters into things or not. So
I think those are all good points. I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces to this. I mean, I do think it's different than the public safety building the police building for a lot of reasons. We have this one location, number one. And ultimately, any of these decisions are kind of risk analysis issue too. So I think seeing it and understanding, to what extent there is a direct life safety issue, say for folks who are at the station, if there's a seismic event, versus is it an equipment, access issue. Those are important things to know. And to be honest with you, I don't know whether or not the estimates are, just having enough coverage for the equipment and then making sure the buildings are seismically safe, or are we doing more than that? We really upgrading the buildings beyond that, so that could affect the costs.
okay. Well, as my comments earlier indicated, I am in favor of us using the 8 million infrastructure reserve because it's just, I think it's in the same category as everything else, and that we do have $15 million a year that we're adding every year to what we spend on infrastructure. And so I don't see any reason for really holding it back. We do have other sources of revenue as well. The overriding question to me, well, first I wanted to say I really appreciated this chart, despite the fact that you guys did not include an extra amount for workers' compensation for the eye strain of the council.
Because you were reading that little one, this is why, as soon as I saw that one, I said, I need one of these, and in for everybody.
No, I think that it presents at least one major issue that I think maybe we can vote on today or not, and that is whether we agree with staff's recommendation that our first overriding priority is the public safety building. We sort of danced around that, but this chart makes it explicit. So this is only a staff recommendation, and council or the committee can either approve it or not today. But it also 3A and 3B gets to a question I think that Councilmember Burt raised, which I keep struggling with, and why I ask questions along some of these things that I've mentioned today. Do we really need a tax measure? To me, that's also complicated by the fact that once we set up priorities, regardless of whether we have a mission statement or a ballot statement that says how we're going to use it, it means that the focus of the election might be on the projects that end up being listed in either box 3A or 3B, rather than on something else, which sort of confuses the message for me as to what, or the message that we're giving to the public. Also, I worry about regardless of the favorable results that are in the poll, I worry about the message we're delivering, that we're running a budget surplus for last year and most likely for this year. So why are we asking for a tax increase? The answer, well, we have to get these projects done. Which projects? So forth. So I keep going back and forth on that, and it's especially appealing to not have a tax measure when we look like we're getting pretty close to all of these things, particularly if we add back in the potential revenue from COPs on leasing out the public safety building space. Anyway, that's where I'm still struggling, don't have an opinion, but I think we have to put on the table a no tax increase instead of just assuming that we're going to have.
I already thought we took that vote to move forward with the TOT. I think we did. And not do the, and not, and Mark's been, you know.
No, but
That's what I thought that vote
I can
was.
still bring it up in full council.
You can,
I'm
no,
just
but.
laying the groundwork for that.
Well, I don't recall, but I don't think, do you think that was right?
We did. It doesn't prohibit you from
No,
we can
this is
move to reconsider, but
Well,
but yes, we did.
Which also gets me to my last major point, and this is for the logistics of our work. We are going to the full council on the 24th of February, and I think that we are not in a position really to be making any particular recommendations yet, but I think that we should be. So I would suggest that we have another meeting on either the 12th or the 13th, so that we can, instead of asking questions and giving comments, make a series of recommendations to our colleagues as to how we ought to be moving forward. And sort of semi-final decisions. The 12th or the 13th would give us time so that they could be included in the written materials for the council for the meeting on the 24th.
I will be away, but conceivably I could call in.
Okay.
I could do the 12th or the 13th.
What time, are we talking about 9 a.m. again?
I'm open to any time.
So I can't do 9 a.m. on the 13th. I can do 9 a.m. on the 12th.
How about 9 a.m. on the 12th?
I'm going to be 2 hours to the west, so that would be 7 a.m. for me. And
no phone calls 2 hours west, or?
Well,
All right, what time? What time?
To get 5 hours west before you.
10 would be better by me.
Right. 10 o'clock on the 12th?
That's fine.
fine with me.
Okay. So the idea there would be for us to be crafting some proposals for our colleagues to at least consider on the 24th. And
If the committee could be as ready as possible when you came, then that could help the crafting, everybody sort of have their ducks.
right.
And then it's just,
And at the
how do you
12th,
merge the
we'd also
ducks?
hope to have the answers to the various questions, as much as possible, the questions that were raised here today.
Should we revisit those quickly so that staff understands what information we want them coming back with, or do they feel like they've got?
Well, let's have that's a good suggestion.
I have some comments. I think this chart that, I'm glad to hear that the chair thinks that the chart was valuable.
Yep.
And I'm going along with Councilmember Councilmember Berman's statements before, it really was meant to provoke thought. There's nothing on this chart necessarily that is, in terms of the financing, that's in concrete. Pieces can be moved around, whether it be IR funds or additional revenues from the hotels, and there's a lot of information that you need to make appropriate decisions. But I think one of the things we hoped to get today was a sense of your priorities in terms of these projects that are listed in top, what needs to move from step 3A to 2, et cetera, like we did before, Councilmember Chair Klein, so that we could have a sense of maybe coming back to you at the next meeting as to, and getting your feedback today as to what are the appropriate reserves to take from, or Stanford monies to take from in moving forward. So I think maybe we can come up with a couple of scenarios for you, but knowing which projects you think are important, and we've talked about the public safety building, but other projects that maybe are of appeal, particularly of appeal to the public, like Parks Ketchup or Bixby Park or whatever. In terms of a potential vote down the line, we had discussed before, if you do go to a vote, what are a series of projects that we would pledge, so to speak, to the voters that we would accomplish. So I do think these numbers are, our best guess at this particular point in time, but certainly they can be moved around and they can be adjusted. And I think some of the Councilmember Burt's points about, looking at the TOT flow of revenues, we were aware of the cyclicality of those, and that needs to be taken into account too. But I really do think that we can work on the cash flows and come up with a good picture for you.
If I could just add one other thing to that. So I think when we kind of go over these questions that you had, it would also be good to get a sense that which ones might explicitly connect to a change in the box versus some of them are kind of cross-cutting if we're dealing with kind of cash flows, for example, as far as some flexibility. And I think it's really good that the committee is, raising a bunch of what I would still, for the most part, call a lot of more detailed questions than what we have here and the implications of those. And so you want to have this as good as you possibly can. But even that being said, just on the committee, there are different perspectives and objectives, and then when we get to the council, that's going to happen too. And then lastly, we all know no matter what we do, as far as the best estimate, it's all going to unfold in time very differently. We're going to get to it. Just give you a couple examples. We could get to a situation with the bike pedestrian plan like the streets, which is there's too much going on or whatever, and suddenly we say, gosh, we need to push that out a few years, and that may free up other funding. Or we're going to do a construction project, and suddenly the construction project costs more than we had estimated. So we're going to have ways to be able to make adjustments and move things over time. So I know that you all know this. So no matter what we do at any point in time, it's still going to be dynamic going forward. Last thing, I will say this, that I really think to the extent that you can still use the approach we were using of, it's not quite those babushka dolls, right, that have something inside of each one of them, but if we could settle on like the big one on the outside, like the public safety building, suddenly the moving parts, particularly between four people, start to shrink. And that was sort of the thought. So you ultimately get down to maybe 3 or 4 factors that are moving, not having to look at all 20 of them simultaneously. Thanks.
Well, I have a few. Well, go ahead. I have 2 more questions that I should have asked. One, any progress on the public safety building to report?
Well, yes, but it won't seem like it's. The only progress is on the staff side, which is since your last meeting we've met. I've directed the staff to both compile all of the different, analyses that we've done in the past on different locations and where they were. Also to identify some other possibilities, that might not have been looked at, and have our real estate people look at them. And even to think about some properties that could be in private holding that still might be somehow viable, or in other locations, so that we could relatively quickly start to come back and sort of know the lay of the land, and then we might get more specific direction from the committee to proceed with the land piece. I mean, I think the biggest question really is, where's the location for this going to be? We're not going to design or redesign a building until we get that thing set. But I want to go back to what I said earlier. I really think it makes a huge difference allocating the funding on being able to plan for the building. It even makes us more of a credible site acquirer. Lalo, what was the issue we ran into the last time? Remember with the Brown site, and the fact that we didn't have funding and that sort of thing available?
We could not do design build and use geo bonds.
Right. So, I mean, the sense that we even have money gives us some other options on how we want to plan on being able to do construction, or it may impact on our ability to put together deals and that sort of thing. So, thanks. So, we don't have a timeline on this work, but we did make it clear that we wanted to be able to report to you. There've been all different kinds of suggestions over the past 20 years of sites and schemes and things, and we want to put that together. And I still presume that even when we got to that point, ultimately the council would want to direct us to still maybe bring somebody in to help us do an additional analysis of those. So we'll maybe give you an update at the next meeting on a timeline.
Okay, another round of comments or questions or motions. Pat?
I'll try and be quick. One is I neglected to mention that I think Bixby Park should be included in 3A, that it both belongs there and it will broaden public support. I think it'll fit now if we make some of these other changes.
I agree.
Second, Greg brought up this concern over the History Museum and the what had been the plan for the transfer of development right revenues. Something that we had talked about as a city long ago is that downtown's not the only potential receiver site for those TDRs. It may be the most valuable receiver site, but not the only one. And something that we never did talk about, and I don't want to go into it in depth here, but just to get people thinking about it, is that we perhaps should have all along been thinking of whether PCs should be receivers for transfer of development rights. If somebody wants to build a PC, they got to buy TDRs for any overage. So that's a thought. And then finally, on that Cal Lab building, there's another element to this notion of a 5-story, 270 space lot, and that is the same discussion we had when we built the garages downtown, which is from an urban design standpoint. Do you really want your largest, most prominent structure in your downtown to be a parking garage? And if you had a 5-story, 270 space garage on Cal Ave, that would be far and away the biggest building in that Cal Ave center area. And so I'd have an urban design concern about that too. But it goes back into this whole concept of, do we, as we're having these parallel paths of TDM, RP, permit parking in the neighborhoods, and increasing supply, do we go to the high end of the supply increase before we have a better understanding of how effective the TDM program will be? And that's part of my hesitation too. It doesn't mean that we would never consider additional parking in either downtown or Cal Ave. It's a question of, do you build a huge amount prior to this aggressive TDM program that we're all committed to?
I just want to say something on this. I don't want there to be any confusion at all that the staff has done anything more on this parking garage issue other than a very simple estimate that says we have to go to the infrastructure committee. If there's some things, if you took the surface lots the city has, what could that yield as far as garage space?
I think that's a different analysis than what we've had for almost all the other components here.
Right.
We've got $16.5 million that's coming in under the 3A, and all the other things have been flushed out much better than that one. And just at that high level, which I recognize we're at, I think using that kind of top-down analysis of what's the capacity to build versus what's the need and what's the funding availability is not the way I'd go about that particular item.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to get an argument about it, but we only were doing it, again, more to sort of say, what's the dollar impact on available revenues? Because we actually don't program that Cal Avenue garage at all. It's floating out there into the future. It's in a remaining unfunded project.
Gotcha.
So we was just to sort of show, you know, what things are hanging, and this was one of the reasons we left it unfunded was precisely because of the reasons that you were talking about, Pat. We had no idea whether or not that was what the need was.
Well, I would agree that there is some need.
Greg?
So I would say that I think that we definitely need to quantify what that need is out on Cal Ave. And I think that's something we haven't paid enough attention to. I mean, I know my office is on Cal Avenue, and there is a serious parking problem on Cal Avenue. And the merchants, in fact, the guy from Keeble and Shooker was just telling me the other day that he's concerned that his customers are having trouble finding places to park, and they're really a destination there. And, you know, there's a lot of cars parked in the neighborhoods there. And so I think that we need to get ahead of this as opposed to getting behind it. And I think part of that is understanding what the impact, how many cars are in the neighborhoods there, what we need to in terms of a garage. I mean, you don't want it to be a crisis like it is downtown before we decide to act. And I think that's the important part. So I really commend you guys for bringing forward the garage thing. I think we just need to refine it and figure out what we actually need to build.
Just one last thing. This is from the damned if you do, damned if you don't department, right? I mean, the garages are a recent, you know, infusion into this conversation beyond the
I don't
hybrid.
think there's any damned if you do.
Pardon me?
I don't think there's any damned if you do.
Well, there's multiple dammers available. But anyway, my point just was, if we hadn't put anything in about the Cal Avenue garage on a funding, what a possible funding piece would be, and we came forward, people would say, well, what about the Cal Avenue garage? What's the potential impact on that? So, I mean, we just look at this as a plug number to sort of say, okay, here's the potential implications and the trade-offs, and it's allowed us to even elicit this conversation. So, we will be coming back on the garage issues for more council direction. Hopefully, we'll have a little more the ability to support a more robust conversation on the garages when we do that, even later this month.
Mark?
When are we getting more meat on the bone in regards to the off-site parking garage idea or parking lot idea?
Offset.
Yeah.
But
Satellite?
we are coming to the council on the parking-related responses on February 10th. Now,
Okay.
that being said, much of what we're doing is asking for the policy direction to be able to pursue an idea or to issue an RFP or that sort of a thing. So it doesn't necessarily mean we're gonna have cooked projects that we can come and say, but we will ask for specific direction, for example, on pursuing, you know, how to proceed with a city-built downtown garage, for example, or should we issue RFPs for public-private sector opportunities for some garages, just to sort of see what's out there?
So I guess my question was,
do we look at a satellite lot down in the east, in the Bayshore area, and again, direction on an RFP for shuttle service and those sorts of things? But those are all going to require subsequent, work and detail.
do you anticipate having any kind of soft numbers for how much those different items would cost, or is it really going to be at a very high level?
I think it's generally high level, but I mean, so I think some of them are big numbers. I mean, you know, when we talk about the shuttle program, I mean, I don't know what we spend now on the shuttle program. $150,000 or something, I don't know.
You're thinking that money's going to come out of this?
For the
For just the
satellite parking?
Yeah.
I don't know where else it's going to. I mean,
Oh, no, well, this gives me the opportunity to point out that our jurisdiction here is not intended to cover every possible expense of the cities. For example, we long ago said catch-up expenses at Cumberly are not part of this.
Yep.
And I think you did say something along the lines of that if we needed some additional, that what you're going to bring forth on satellite parking and things like that are going to have recommendations as to funding outside of this.
Okay. I mean, I was thinking it might have an impact on surpluses, but that would be an impact in 2015, not in 2014, I imagine. So you're right that it wouldn't impact the numbers we're looking at here. And then I don't know if somebody mentioned, but also just getting a better understanding of the $6 million for sidewalks, just as a follow-up as to where that number came from and what that means would be helpful for prioritizing that item.
And what cycle we should use. I mean, what would be the right approach to sidewalks? That's really the question.
Okay, and I just want to point out, that's the thing that we're putting forward to study as part of the CIP project next fiscal year.
And even, yeah, and I mean, you know, if we lower it from 30 to 25 years and that has a $6 million tag, that's a $6 million over 25 years. That's not a $6 million immediately expenditure. I would, if we're talking about that kind of thing.
Okay. Any other comments, questions, or motions?
Well, I think we should make that motion you talked about prioritizing the public safety building, so that's explicit. So I'd move that we prioritize the public safety building and make sure that's the number one thing we do.
I'll second.
Okay, that's of course, a recommendation to the council for the meeting of the 27th, 24th, sorry. Correct? Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Any discussion?
No, I think we should just go build the public safety building tomorrow. Just let's get going on it.
And it was very nice of you to volunteer your house. Now we have the site.
I have a vacant lot next to my house. Go for it.
All right, all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye. Anything else? Okay, we're adjourned then until our meeting at 10 a.m.
Except for the other two items.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I have to leave in 5 minutes. But
Well, okay, all right.
The city attorney has arrived.
Yes, all right.
At the table.
We have,
Short update, I can make your 5, in fact, I'll take 2 if it's 5, if it's 5 or 3.
We have 2 other items.
yeah, thank you for running. I'm not sure, well, you have you have item number 2.
I do. So council members,
Go ahead, please.
just a very short update for the committee. We now have a working draft of a modernized telephone user tax measure in hand, and we'll be circulating that internally in the city for refinement. Subject to any further direction or discussion from the committee today, we would plan to work with the city manager to find a place on the full council's agenda to bring that item forward. We would not include in the draft, but note in the staff report to potential areas that council could elect to address, and those would be potentially making a change in the telephone user tax rate, and the second item would be modifying or eliminating the large user discount on gas, electric, and water. And we would include some preliminary, very high-level cost implications for those types of changes so that council could consider whether they wanted to take that up. But that would not be in the draft because we have not been asked specifically to prepare those items to date.
Is that within the jurisdiction? I mean, were we planning on discussing those items, or were we just going to do it to full council? I just wasn't sure.
Full council.
And I think we're finished with item number 2.
Well, yeah, I'm very concerned that you not do any work that the council hasn't authorized. So, for example, I have not heard any council member yet speak in favor of the idea of increasing the utility user tax rate to any of our customers. So I think you ought to wait until you hear at least a couple of council members say they're interested in that.
Well, I'm happy not to even raise it in the staff report. I certainly wouldn't bring it forward as a
No, I
draft
think it's important to
ordinance.
raise it in the staff
Oh,
report. I think
I
it's
don't-
important to give options to the council.
No, I don't have any problem raising the issue, but that's just one sentence.
That's
But,
correct.
Just for example, pulling it out of the air, you could have a variety of different rate structures, and the one that we passed 25 years ago did have a lot of that consideration, and I wouldn't want staff to be thinking about a new or different rate structure until some council members had indicated that they were interested in that.
Well, we have had some discussions, I thought. We've actually talked a little bit about this at council, and it may have come up.
Mr. Borog has mentioned it, but the council members have not discussed it in my recollection.
Either way, we don't have any direction.
Yeah, we don't have any direction.
I think the staff has just mentioned that some communities have maintained the telephone user portion of the rate when they've modernized the language. In other words, left the status quo. Others have, in fact, elected to put a slight decrease in the rate in place. And there is no direction, as far as I recall, from council on that, but I think you would call that out.
That's a separate issue.
But this is an important point, Larry. I mean, normally the staff comes to us with a recommendation. And I think staff should feel free to look at this and come up with recommendations that they think are appropriate without council direction. I mean, there's been some council direction to bring back forward a modernization of a TOT. And
Yes.
staff should say, yes, this is how you should modernize it. You should look at the rates on these issues. You should look at, increasing or decreasing that. These things tend to pass. If you decrease the rate slightly, you may want to get rid of and broaden it. I think all of that's appropriate for staff to make recommendations on. They do that all the time to us, and I think that's appropriate for Molly to do work on it, and I think it's appropriate for staff to make recommendations as what staff thinks it should look like.
I think there's a fine line there. I don't want staff going, we've seen some examples in the past where staff has spent a lot of time on something where the council really had no interest in it, and that's not been a good use of time.
So, Joe, in terms of just providing some very general numbers about, say, what a telephone user tax rate decrease would result in terms of revenues, is that a lot of work, or is that something that could be done relatively easily? I'm actually talking about the other piece first, the potentially reducing the telephone user tax rate.
Right, well, it's about, if we were to reduce, it's about 2.5, let's say 2.5 million roughly. So that's at 5%. So it depends on, we can calculate, it's not hard to calculate, it's in terms of like what an eighth of a percent, or a quarter of a percent would be in reduction.
So it sounds like it's an hour of Joe's time to run some calculations and plug it into the report.
I'm focused on the other aspect of it,
Okay.
which was, since I was part of it, I can tell you it was heavily negotiated, and it's not a trivial item.
And that's the large user discount on the gas, electric, and water.
It would be, we mentioned last time, it's about $475,000 to eliminate the large user.
Well, yeah, but this is precisely the discussion I don't want to get into.
Right. So we'll note the issue briefly in the staff report, and council can decide to take it up or not.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Well, I actually think it should be explored in the staff report. Well, we disagree on this.
Yep.
I think those are staff
When you want the
decisions.
staff report to come?
So I had said that we would confer and make a proposal on that, you and I.
You ready to move to item number 3? Do you want to make a motion?
No?
Okay. Communications on the outreach plan for infrastructure funding measure. Claudia? And I was gonna cut you off.
You were gonna, yeah.
No, but I was seeing what you have there as timing. I think we need to coordinate that with what's going before the council, and I don't think we're quite there yet. So, please go ahead.
Charles Heath from TDWB. At your last infrastructure meeting, you directed staff to come back with a ballot measure preparation and outreach informational campaign plan. You've got it in your packet. Charles Heath is our consultant from TDWB. Thought we'd just go through the plan and some of the time frames and the milestones that we've recalibrated a little bit to reflect where we are today. So I'll turn it over to
Can we afford to have you have a seat at the
Well,
table?
Sorry.
I hope so.
Scoot over.
It's in someone's lap. Yeah. It's in someone's lap.
I didn't know if we were trying to get you out of here immediately.
Okay, thanks.
You look confused.
I didn't know if
Got a
we were
talking
even-
head about your.
No. I thought the chair's comment maybe was to really expedite us out of here.
Oh.
Well, in the interest of time, we've laid out a plan with some timelines and milestones in terms of how we now conduct the outreach based on the direction that the committee provided on January 10th. I think we can break this down into a few key components. Initially, as the city attorney is working on with the proposed UUT measure, I think a first step here is to develop potential ballot language so that we have something to vet as part of the outreach process. And then beyond that, the actual outreach will occur looking at the community in these two audiences. One is sort of key stakeholders that we can break down into key groups, where we'll look at who the appropriate staff representatives would be to go out to those groups, engage them on the prospect of a TOT measure going to the ballot in November, receive feedback and engage in that dialogue. Then there's the broader electorate, and we've included in here a plan for utilizing direct mail, social media, and some online advertising in order to get the message out to those voters in the run-up to a council decision that's scheduled tentatively for June to formally call for the election. So all of that is outlined in the memo that you have before you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Mark, Greg, I'll start then. I'm fine with all of that, except I think we ought to not do anything except prepare the draft ballot measure language and until the council meets on the 24th.
That's the way you talked about.
Our plan is to use the month of February to develop the content, develop the outreach targets, and then be prepared, immediately follow that meeting to start the actual outreach.
We do some of the legwork, so we're ready to go.
Mark?
So, I think Chair Klein's point is a good one, but it sounds like you guys are factoring that into your work schedule. One thing that you guys should also keep in mind, just as a kind of broader part of your communication outreach, is emphasizing the good work that's already been done with existing funds. So showing that, we've been responsible with the funding we have, but there's just, there are more needs than there are funds. So we're talking about the fact that, council immediately instituted the keep up number that the IBRC recommended, the $2.2 million more a year in keep up funding. A lot of the good work that's been done in addition to that on funding streets and sidewalk repairs and trying to increase the education level of residents on all the good work that's happened on those fronts to date should also be an element, I guess. That's a very good point. Communications.
I don't have anything.
Any other thoughts for us?
No, I think we'll be, like I said, continue to work and the direction we'll meet again on February 24th. We'll have a lot of these things ready to go.
What would you plan on having ready for the council meeting on the 24th?
Well, I think, as Charles mentioned, a lot of the things that the stakeholders for our TOT, we can start putting together lists and sort of our approaches, some of the graphics and info things we're going to revisit because they were reflecting when we first started balloting. So none of this would be public. It's all sort of behind the scenes prep so that we've got some of that the communications infrastructure, if you will, ready to go, and then proceed along when the council has their meeting.
Anything else, colleagues? All right. I think we're done.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming down.
No worries.
Right.
I live in